Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, congressional politics may be becoming more national in focus and less local. The reason and the results could have a big impact on who governs and who has the most influence. We'll take a look. We'll also examine a heated Public Service Commission race that could change the balance of power and the latest state budget cuts. In other news, we'll look at new procedures for NOPD rape investigations, a rare ruling of homicide in a parish prison death, and with Thanksgiving approaching, encouraging news about the local economy. At our table are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. From Baton Rouge, Jeremy Alford, publisher, lawpolitics.com. Naomi Martin, reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. And Clancy Dubose, political editor and columnist, Gambit. And we're going to go first over to Clancy, and welcome to this table. I haven't seen you in quite a while.
Thanks
Good
for having me back.
Here. Okay, politics is local. Maybe not so much anymore.
Yeah, Tip O'Neill has been quoted more than anybody on that level. When I think he said back in the 30s, all politics is local, and it was a mantra, and it was a truism for all the right reasons, because it was true. Voters tended to vote even in national elections, like for the Senate, based on local concerns. That was certainly true in Louisiana, and that explains how Mary Landrieu, in a state that continued to trend red, continued to get reelected. That ended this year, not just in Louisiana, but I think nationally, and you can trace that to a 2010 ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, actually a pair of rulings. One was the Citizens United case, and I forget the name of the other, but they came out weeks apart, and effectively they gave rise to a new political animal called super PACs. And what they are independent PACs, supposedly, but instead of giving money to a candidate, they can spend unlimited amounts of money in supporting or opposing a candidate, as long as they don't coordinate it, allegedly, with a particular candidate. And the other thing that makes them so extraordinary is that, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling, now corporations and trade unions can give unlimited amounts of money to these super PACs, and some of that, or much of that, is not even reportable. So you've basically got this secret society of millionaire individuals and organizations that are funneling millions and millions of dollars legally into political campaigns, not directly to the candidates, but into organizations that clearly are set up with an agenda to support or oppose particular candidates or groups of candidates. And what you have, and we saw it a little bit in the presidential race in 2012, and we saw it even more so. Less money overall, but more widespread impact in the Senate races this year, these midterm elections. And now here's one little interesting tidbit about that. Republicans get knocked for being the party of the big rich and having all the money. In this election cycle, 2014, Democratic super PACs actually raised and spent more money than Republican super PACs. And I think what that showed is that when the tide is running against you, as it was against Democrats because of the unpopularity of Barack Obama, not just in Louisiana, but nationwide, all the money in the world can't stop the tsunami of voter anger and voter resentment, whether they're angry at Barack Obama or George W. Bush, which was the case 8 years ago when Bush, in his 6th year of his presidency, lost the Senate, lost the House.
That tide did turn, though, in the runoff. Now we're seeing Republican super PACs outspending the Democratic super PACs. But these super PACs have become so powerful, so influential, that they're making the parties, the political parties on the state level, basically obsolete.
Less relevant, for sure.
Right. And that's why you're seeing the Louisiana Republican Party and the Louisiana Democratic Party both fighting to get the same status for their independent expenditure groups. They want to raise money with no limits whatsoever, and they want unlimited spending as well. And they're doing that in the courts, and they're doing that on the federal level.
Yeah, of course, what you talked about in terms of the Senate runoff, the tide changing, I don't know that that was so much a tide as it was the Democrats just running out of money and writing Mary Landrieu off. But overall, if you look at the primary in Louisiana on November 4th, Landrieu, along with the Democratic Party and the super PACs that supported her, raised and spent about $16 million. Cassidy and the Republican Party and the Republican-oriented super PACs raised and spent about $11 million. The Cassidy campaign was much more effective. Its message was very simple, very focused. Barack Obama bad, Mary Landrieu with Barack Obama.
97% of the time.
I'm against Barack Obama. That was it. And when you can boil your message down to something that a fourth grader can understand, you can accomplish a lot in politics.
The saddest part about that is most voters still don't know who Bill Cassidy is.
Yeah.
He's just been able to focus on that one message.
I'll bet you 2/3 of the voters who vote for Cassidy don't even know where he lives.
Yeah, and they're probably more energized about voting against Mary Landrieu.
Yeah, it's actually against Barack Obama, but they've tied
right, exactly.
Obama and Landrieu so closely together. It's Mary Barack Obama.
So it's like a virtual candidacy. I think that's how you.
Actually, it was Rush Limbaugh who coined the term virtual candidate. Applied that to Bill Cassidy. Limbaugh in the primary was for Rob Maness, and that. Like a lot of things, Rush Limbaugh says it gained a lot of currency, and it was also pretty accurate because, Cassidy is a virtual candidate. He won't even go to a Walmart. And if there's a safe place in Louisiana for a Republican candidate to go shake hands, it's got to be a Walmart. Cassidy goes nowhere. I think they've got him locked up somewhere because they're afraid he'll say something or do something that, could screw it up. But
yeah.
And you also saw on election night where Mary Landrieu was trying to list off the things she's done and where was Bill, and so she's listing these accomplishments. You just get the feeling it's not sticking. That's not the issue. It's not what people.
And everything she says is accurate. And I think now voters have reached a point where when voters are angry enough, they don't care. They don't want to hear about logic. They don't want to hear about clout. When they're angry at somebody or something, logic and reason go out the door. I'm not saying that the voting for Bill Cassidy is illogical. I'm just saying that if Landrieu tries to make a logical appeal to them on the basis of her clout, it's not going to work because they're angry. And it's human nature. When people are angry, they don't want to listen to somebody try to explain things to them. They want to vent, and that's what's happening.
What happened to campaign finance reform?
Interesting note that came out, a statement that came out on election night from Bob Schieffer, the CBS political analyst. He talked about the super PACs and everything that we've been discussing and the impact of super PACs. He said 40 years ago this year, Richard Nixon resigned and most of his aides went to jail. And the aides that went to jail, most of them went to jail for doing things with campaign finance that today are perfectly legal. So what we've done with campaign finance reform, we've made corruption, graft, and bribery legal. We've given the people who want to influence elections with big money the loopholes or the means to do it, both through congressional legislation and Supreme Court rulings. So I wouldn't call that reform, but that's
it's the Wild West of modern politics.
Yes, it is.
I wonder if another factor on this subtle domination of national issues is the preponderance of talk media out there. Like at nighttime on the cable stations, there's probably 3 or 4 of them that have a lot of talk where they're focusing on those kind of issues. The sort of sub-tier issues that in the past wouldn't have gotten much attention at the national level.
And you're right. And to show you that it cuts both ways, the American Federation of Teachers, which is a national teachers union, spent $450,000 in a handful of Jefferson Parish school board elections in the primary. They set up a super PAC, which was designed to help a small group of union-supported candidates in Jefferson Parish. So this is not a Republican issue, it's not a Democratic issue, it's a money issue. If you've got big money and you want to buy an election, there's now a legal way to do it.
All right, we're going to get back to more political talk in just a minute, but right now I'm going to go over to Naomi, and something pretty rare happened in that we have a homicide classification and a parish prison death.
Right, so when Dr. Jeff Rouse, the Orleans Parish Coroner, was running for office over the springtime, he talked about wanting to win back the public's trust for an office that had long been seen as being sort of biased towards law enforcement. So this was his first ruling of an inmate death, and it was the first of its kind, at least in recent history, for the city. What it is an inmate had a fight at Orleans Parish Prison and shortly after died of a heart attack. And it's a normal, natural cause death, but because of the fight that preceded it, Dr. Rouse came to the conclusion that it was a homicide because if not for the fight, he said the inmate wouldn't have had a heart attack at that moment. So this is a pretty common ruling in other jurisdictions, and a lot of experts said it's a phenomenon called homicide by heart attack, but it's the first of the kind, at least in this city, at least in modern history.
And this was a death that occurred, the fight happened in March, and then the gentleman's name was Mr. Lee, is that correct?
Willie Lee, he was 40 years old, and It happened in March. The ruling took about 8 months because the sheriff's office was slow in getting video evidence and other evidence to the coroner's office. And the coroner did say that he took his time making the consideration. He knew this was going to be controversial. He knew it was going to be a big departure from his predecessor, Dr. Frank Minyard. And so he took the time. Another thing that kind of stands out about this is that Dr. Rouse went to the Willie Lee's family directly on Monday and talked to them about the ruling before he made the public announcement. And that was a big shift because in the past, families have complained about not being notified by law enforcement agencies, not being, being kept in the dark about when someone dies in custody.
How long did it take after the fight for the heart attack to occur? Was it like within a day or two?
It was within about 90 minutes, actually.
Oh, wow, right
he
away.
collapsed shortly after the fight, and then within 90 minutes he was pronounced dead.
And also the family was not made aware of this. They didn't find out for a few days after the gentleman had died.
They found out through inmates, and then eventually they went to the sheriff's office themselves. The sheriff's office said they had an outdated address on file for the family. They lived in New Orleans East, and so they went to the sheriff's office themselves, and that's when they found out. But it wasn't for almost 24 hours later.
So where is this going legally in terms of responsibility for the sheriff's office? I mean, 2 inmates having a fight in prison is not an unusual thing, so.
Right, well, so the district attorney, Leon Canizero, is going to have the final decision on whether the inmate who got in the fight should be charged. And what's actually interesting is that there's only been one other homicide ruling in the jail in the past 10 years, and that was a stabbing, which is a much more clear-cut homicide case. So it's going to be up to either the sheriff's office or the NOPD to decide whether they should arrest the other inmate on a murder charge, manslaughter, and so, or if they want to believe his claims of self-defense and say that it was a justifiable homicide. But in any case, it's going to be up to, finally, it'll be up to the district attorney whether to press charges.
Do you know if he's going to have a grand jury investigate this? Or well, because when you have a murder indictment, it takes a grand jury. So I'm wondering, has the DA announced anything in that regard?
He's been keeping quiet about this so far because he hasn't seen the investigation yet. He hasn't even gotten a report on it yet, so he didn't want to speak. And his office didn't want to comment yet on it, but I would assume they would probably present it to the grand jury and let the grand jury decide.
And at first, the sheriff's comments were about this were what? What did the sheriff's office have to say about Mr. Lee's death?
They put out a press release right afterwards and said, that they were saddened about an inmate having died, but they did emphasize that he had extensive heart disease and, sort of made it seem like it was going to be a natural causes ruling, which was the case in many other similar circumstances in the past under a different coroner.
Any comment on this now homicide classification from the sheriff?
He hasn't made a comment yet, and his spokesman didn't comment either yet.
Okay. All
But
right,
at a
thanks.
minimum, it seems that with the new coroner, it's kind of a new day when it comes to prison deaths. And I think Rouse is, like you said, he's making a real statement here. And there was some talk about this during the coroner's election, but I think this really brings it home, just how important that office is.
Right. Thanks a lot, Naomi. We're going to move on again to some more political discussion right now. Over to Jeremy and the Public Service Commissioner race. That's a pretty heated one right now.
Right, first district runoff, I think it's probably one of the more important runoff elections in Louisiana that folks around the state have heard the least about. And to really understand it, you need to look at some numbers, and I have to apologize. I know we promised Clancy there'd be no math today. But Eric Skrmetta, currently the chairman of the PSC, only received 95,000 votes in the primary. His opponents collectively received 163,000. That's a massive margin to overcome. And La Politics Weekly obtained an internal poll from Forrest Wright this week that shows Wright with a 10-point lead, 55-45. The way we got here is that Wright's campaign, it was really a masterful campaign, was able to link the chairman, Skrmetta, to taking donations from the companies that he's supposed to be regulating. And in return, I would say that Skrmetta and his camp didn't take this campaign seriously. So here we are in the runoff. What has changed? Republicans are paying attention because this could end up, if Wright wins, it could end up creating a quasi-democratic majority on the PSC. And I say quasi because Wright is a Republican. Just a few months ago, he was a Democrat. There are some groups that he has worked with that have the perception of being left-leaning. And also, we see Skrmetta going up on the air, trying to make these connections. Wright's media buy ends today. his campaign manager told me that they may very well buy back in next week, whereas Scrimetta started the runoff with about $214,000 in the bank. Wright has, as of Wednesday, $65,000. So I think a lot of folks are watching this race. The PSC is an extremely important board. They regulate utility companies, among other functions, and this could very well decide the swing vote on the commission.
Well, Wright had been associated with Alliance for Affordable Energy, is that right?
That's right, and I think there's a perception there that they are a left-leaning group. You'd be hard-pressed to find a large number of Republicans who support the group and align themselves with them. I think it's easy to maybe point to solar issues on this, but I think they encompass a much larger policy agenda.
And so if Wright would be elected, I mean, what kind of policy shift would you anticipate, or would there be any, if it just stays status quo?
There's only a few opportunities for really clear liberal conservative lines to be drawn on PSC issues, but they are there. And if there comes up an issue where maybe Lambert Boissier and Foster Campbell, the two Democrats on the board, I think that even as a Republican, Wright would be probably one of the more progressive members of that board, and you could see a three-member alliance right there. The two other Republicans on that board right now are Scott Angel and Clyde Holloway, and they team up with Scrimetta right now to create the Republican majority on the PSC.
But the PSC doesn't regulate solar, does it?
No, not directly. I think that's a misnomer that's been floated this
campaign cycle. And so it's an issue
cycle.
in the sense politically it is, but in reality it's
right.
The perception is Scrimetta takes money from companies, utilities that he regulates. The Alliance for Affordable Energy, which I would call not so much a left-leaning group, but a consumer advocacy group. Consumers versus the big utilities, because I don't think it's a liberal or conservative issue when it comes to the size of a utility bill. I don't know one Republican business owner who likes having large utility bills.
Good point.
So, but you could, I guess, if you say that if you're for consumers, you're a liberal. But in that case, I think there'd be a lot more Republicans who claim to be liberals when they get their monthly utility bills. But the axis on the PSC is utility versus consumer, I think, in most of those votes, because it gets down to rates. How much can they charge, and also the rate base. What items can be included in what is defined as the rate base, because they get a guaranteed rate of return because they're monopolies, and that's why they're regulated by the PSC. Solar companies are not regulated because they're not monopolies, and they compete against each other, and they compete against Entergy and other utility monopolies.
And the Alliance for Affordable Energy has been around a long time, back to the days of fighting Grand Gulf and the regulation of that, and they were the ones responsible for taking the regulatory power of in Orleans away from the PSC, where it had been transferred back to the city council. So it's
you and I covered that fight, Errol.
Yeah, I know, it's the whole story. So it has been an advocacy group, yeah.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Jeremy, and that. We're going to go over to stay with Errol right now, talking about economy. Some economic good news, you say, for the city.
I think a few years ago there was a program that we did, and after the show was over, we were talking about the stories we'd had, and all of them were upbeat. And we're saying, man, this was really a positive story tonight. It really looks good. Well, it turns out that was the Friday night before Katrina. Okay, and I remember that was our happy show. So beware of too much good news. But at least on economic city's surplus, and we mentioned it sort of like in the context of Thanksgiving coming up this week, and always want to look at something to be thankful for, is that the city is projecting a $14.6 million surplus. A lot of that has to do with sales tax revenue. And you drive around town, you see where that's coming from. If you drive down Carrollton Avenue in the Mid-City Market, that's so successful, it's just causing traffic jams now. And you stay on Carrollton, you go to the Costco, and not far away there's other places that are open. And so there's a lot of economic, there's a lot of retail activity going on in the city, and there's been some advancement in fee collection, and so the surplus is definitely good news. On the other hand,
and this is a real surplus. It's not a Bobby Jindal surplus,
right? This is the
I
real
know Jeremy
thing.
can talk about that later. But.
Okay. But then on the other hand, the city is warning, and the CAO's office says, well, that's good, but about half of it has to go to that fireman's pension fund that we have to pay, and also for that consent decree for the sheriff's office. So it's about 7.8, and so that still leaves us a good chunk and puts us ahead of most cities. But at least there's growth at a time when retail is in trouble in a lot of other places.
Well,
so I think that'd be a good news for this time.
It is good news. You certainly want to hear about growth and not the opposite. But the money's going to be spent as soon as it comes in. We do know that. Thanks a lot, Errol.
Yeah.
Naomi, back over to you now. We've heard over the past week or so the stories about the sex crimes unit over at NOPD and rape investigations or lack thereof. So there are some changes that are happening there.
Yes, the Inspector General found widespread downgrading and largely ignoring of almost more than 1,000 cases of child abuse and rape. So the first thing NOPD is trying to do is figure out why are these problems keep occurring, because they're not new. The Justice Department found them in 2011. Outside groups, the media has been reporting on this for years. So NOPD is first doing an internal review to try to figure out how did this shoddy police work go undetected by supervisors, by higher levels of management for so long, as well as some of the changes that they're putting in place immediately, however, are mandatory checklist for every detective to check off, certain layers of supervision, have been looking at the case. But again, they're still sort of keeping it they're not being very specific with what the reforms are going to be yet, because they're not yet sure what the problems are.
Are cases being reopened? Are they taking a look at some of these cases that were not followed up on?
They're definitely reopening 271 cases that 5 detectives deemed crimes but never wrote investigative reports on. And so those 270 cases are going to be getting a look. And then there's another large portion of cases that were deemed non-crimes, and among those were some really horrific crimes, like a toddler being testing positive for a sexually transmitted disease, or a child who complained of being abused by a registered sex offender in the same house. So things like that, the police department is going to be looking at those cases, but their priority is on these 270 cases that the Inspector General identified.
Have personnel been brought into that sex crimes unit?
Yeah, they brought in the former commander of the unit, who was over the unit in 2010, 2011, when they cleared a backlog of 800 untested rape kits. Paul Noel, he's over the 2nd District Uptown right now. He's going to remain in that position while still leading this new task force of 3 detectives and a sergeant, looking at all these cases that were neglected. And
meanwhile, there's calls also from at least one member of the council for an outside group to come in and do a total evaluation, not just of sex crimes, but of NOPD. So I guess that on top of the federal consent decree and the police monitor to take a look at NOPD and what's going on over there. Thanks a lot, Naomi.
Thank you.
Jeremy, state budget cuts. We were just hearing from Errol about how the cities, the revenues are looking pretty good. Not the case for the state.
Definitely not. The Joint Budget Committee heard a plan this morning presented by the Division of Administration. There were $180 million worth of budget cuts and revenue alterations. About 150 of it, Governor Jindal is going to do through executive action. The other $30 million is going to have to be approved by the Joint Budget Committee next month. But we saw 167 positions eliminated, and no one lost their job today. These are positions that were left vacant. They determined that instead of paying a salary and rehiring someone to fill the position, they would just get rid of it. There's also $130 million worth of one-time money that's going to be put into the current fiscal year budget to address recurring needs. And this is what drives the conservatives in the House crazy. It makes the so-called fiscal hawks squawk, is that we're using this one-time money to address recurring needs. And so the administration promised that this would be painless, that they wouldn't target higher ed. And it was like a magic show. They found some cash underneath the cushion and they plugged the hole. But I think next year is a totally different situation. We're looking at a $1.4 billion budget hole. The governor is not going to improve any kind of revenue generating measures, which is just a fancy way of saying taxes. And most of all, though, the 2 most accessible parts of the budget for cutting are health care and higher education. Voters just approved a set of constitutional amendments that takes Medicaid and other parts of the healthcare budget off the table. So there's going to be a huge target on the back of higher education, and they may very well be facing one of the most treacherous sessions in recent memory.
And there have been some treacherous sessions for them in these past few years. They're saying they just can't take any more cuts.
They've been cut to the bone repeatedly.
Explain to me this. A few weeks ago, didn't the administration announced that they found $171 million, and John Kennedy was
they
at the-
found over $300 million.
Was it
They
that?
had a $141 million deficit, which Standard & Poor's, Moody's, one of those recognized, talking about your gold standard, Wall Street said, Louisiana, Bobby Jindal, you have a deficit. And he goes on to meet the press and says, we've never had a deficit, and yada, yada. And he had a deficit. They magically found over $300 million and said, no, we don't have a deficit. We have $171 million, I think, surplus. Now they found another, how much?
180.
180. So that makes it close to $500 million that they found in the last 6 weeks.
Right. Now I
So we
interviewed.
should keep telling him he's got a deficit. Who knows how much money he'll find if we keep telling him that we have a hole in the budget.
I interviewed Commissioner of Administration Christy Nichols about that surplus money, and they expect it to be recognized by the Revenue Estimating Conference in January, meaning that it will be can be spent after that. Whether it's identified as a surplus is another question. But the REC meets again in January, and we could see these numbers grow a little bit darker.
Because a lot of that's because of the declining price of oil too. We don't know how far
Oil
that's
and
gonna
individual
slide.
income tax collections.
So bottom line is, though, next year there are going to be some things on the chopping block, is what you see, because we're going to have
it's going to be a tough session.
a tough year.
And what makes it even tougher is that lawmakers are facing re-election.
But do you think they've gone as far as they can go with higher education now? They stayed away from this time. You think next year they'll stay away from it too, or?
It's hard to imagine that they will be able to avoid cutting higher education with a $1.4 billion hole.
And higher education bleeding so much already. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. On to looking ahead quickly. Errol.
The old Brennan's is coming back as the new Brennan's. Next Tuesday, the 25th, it opens for lunch. And then on December 5th, lunch and dinner. And I assume sometimes after that, breakfast. But next Tuesday, we'll be back.
Wonderful. Welcome back, Brennan's. Jeremy.
My syndicated column next week asks the question, is there life after death for Louisiana Democrats? I think that they are facing a tough road, but there are some quick wins ahead in the next couple of years, I think, to lift them back up, and it'll be in the Picayune on Wednesday.
All right, we'll look for it. Naomi.
The alleged Bourbon Street shooter accused of opening fire on Bourbon Street, killing 1 and wounding 9. He is set for trial December 1st.
Okay, thanks.
In
Clancy.
addition to the red-hot PSC race that Jeremy talked about, 2 other local races. There are some local politics left. The race for First Parish Court in Jefferson Parish is going to really get hotter. It's already pretty hot. Allegations of a phony ballot by one candidate. And also, I think we'll see a push, and maybe a push from both directions, on the school board millage race in Orleans Parish. There's a ballot proposition to extend or rededicate a 4.97 mil property tax to keep and maintain and fix up all these new school buildings that we're building.
All righty, Clarence, thanks. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much for joining us. And of course, we hope to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.